The wind across the high plateaus of the American West in 1870 did not just carry the scent of pine and oncoming snow, it carried the weight of a vanishing frontier. To the men of the United States Geographical Survey's west of the 100th meridian, the landscape was not a place of myth, but a series of mathematical problems to be solved. Led by men like Lieutenant George Wheeler and Ferdinand Vanderveer Hayden, these expeditions were the scientific eyes of a growing nation. They were tasked with turning the great American desert into a grid of resources, altitudes, and routes. Their journals were filled with the mundane: the price of mules, the quality of local water, the exact degrees of a mountain slope. But in the late autumn of that year, in a remote stretch of the southwestern territories, the entries began to shift. The dry, clinical language of engineering was suddenly interrupted by observations that did not fit the topographic maps. The sun was setting earlier as the team pushed into the higher elevations. These were men trained at West Point and the finest technical schools in the East. They were skeptics by trade. Yet, as they moved through a series of nameless canyons, the local guides, men who had lived in the shadow of these peaks for generations, began to speak of things that stayed in the dark. They spoke of the old ones, a people who were not just ancestors, but something biologically distinct. Initially, the surveyors brushed these stories aside as folklore, the kind of colorful local color one expects in the wilderness. But that wasn't the strangest part. The silence of the high desert began to feel heavier, and soon the physical evidence would catch up to the legends. By early October, the survey party had reached a limestone ridge that had been sheared open by centuries of erosion. It was here, while scouting for a triangulation point, that a junior surveyor noticed a series of anomalies embedded in the strata. From a distance, they looked like bleached cedar logs, peculiar for their placement so deep within the rock. But as the men climbed closer, the geometric precision of the shapes became undeniable. These were not trees. They were skeletal remains, partially fossilized, partially preserved by the arid mountain air. But the proportions were wrong. According to the fragmentary reports that survived the initial filing, the femur of one specimen alone was nearly half the length of a grown man's torso. The measurements they recorded, however, defied the standard biological records of the era, and for a moment, the mission of the survey changed from mapping the land to cataloging the impossible. It is important to understand the rigor of these 1,870 expeditions. These were not treasure hunters. They were government employees. Every discovery was logged in triplicate. Field notes from this period were traditionally sacrosanct, treated with the same reverence as legal deeds. Records suggest that the lead surveyor on this sub-expedition spent 3 days at the site, meticulously sketching the orientation of the remains and noting the geological context. The sketches described a skull with a prominent supraorbital ridge and a cranial capacity that far exceeded anything in the contemporary medical textbooks of the 19th century. Yet, as the team prepared to transport the smaller fragments back to their base camp, a sense of unease began to permeate the group. It was a detail that would later be omitted from the official government printing, but letters sent home by the camp's cook mentioned that the guides refused to touch the bones, claiming that to disturb them was to invite a forgetting. The discovery was not kept a secret, at least, not at first. Word of the mountain giants began to circulate through the chain of command. In the 1870s, the Smithsonian Institution, under the leadership of Joseph Henry and later John Wesley Powell, was the primary repository for all things curious found in the West. Correspondence from the field indicates that a telegram was dispatched to Washington, informing them of a significant anthropological find in the High Sierras. The response was uncharacteristically swift. Instead of a request for further study or a congratulatory note, the team received a directive to cease exploration of the ridge and to wait for a special representative to oversee the recovery of the documents. What happened next remains unclear. As the daily log for the week of October 14th, appears to have been transcribed later, with several pages missing from the original leather-bound ledger. When the special representative arrived, he wasn't a scientist. He was a man associated with the Department of War, a colonel whose interest seemed less in the biology of the remains and more in the physical records the surveyors had produced. Witnesses later claimed that the atmosphere in the camp changed overnight. The open discussions about the size of the skeletons were replaced by a strict adherence to the topographical mission. The sketches, the detailed measurements of the oversized dentition, and the descriptions of the strange non-local stone tools found near the remains were all surrendered. Records suggest that these items were placed in a heavy, lead-lined dispatch box. And that's when things began to shift from a scientific inquiry to a bureaucratic erasure. Some historians believe that the government's reaction wasn't born out of a desire to hide the existence of a giant race, but rather a desperate need to maintain the narrative of the manifest destiny. If the West was already populated by a sophisticated, physically imposing civilization that had mysteriously vanished, it challenged the idea that the land was a vacant wilderness waiting to be tamed by the East. Others suggest the confiscation was more pragmatic, a fear that such a discovery would ignite a bone rush that would distract from the vital work of mapping the territories for the railroad. Whatever the motivation, the physical evidence was packed into crates, and the surveyors were given new orders. They were to continue their work as if the ridge did not exist. But the men had seen what they had seen, and the memory of those massive, weathered bones stayed with them. One of the surveyors, a man named Elias Thorne, reportedly kept a private diary, a shadow log, that he hid from the Department of War representative. In it, he described the way the skeletons were buried. They weren't scattered by some ancient disaster. They were laid out with care, facing the rising sun, their hands crossed over their massive rib cages. Thorne noted that the bone density was unlike anything he had seen in his studies of human anatomy. It was thick, almost metallic in its weight. He wrote about a particular jawbone that could easily slip over the face of the largest man in their party. But, as the expedition moved further into the interior, Thorne's entries became more guarded. He began to suspect that they were being watched, not just by the shadows of the mountains, but by the very men they worked for. By the time the expedition returned to the regional headquarters in late 1871, the mountain giants had become a whisper. When the final official report of the Wheeler survey was published, thousands of pages long and filled with every detail of soil and stone, there was no mention of the limestone ridge or the remains found within it. The ridge itself was omitted from the updated maps, labeled instead as impassable terrain, or simply left as a blank, unshaded contour. What they found next changed the narrative entirely. Several members of the original scouting party were reassigned to separate, distant territories, ensuring they would never work together again. It was a systematic fracturing of a witness pool. The silence from Washington was not merely bureaucratic, it was foundational. In the years following the 1870 expedition, the American scientific community was undergoing a massive consolidation. The Smithsonian Institution, under the influence of John Wesley Powell, was beginning to standardize the history of the North American continent. This standardization required a clean, linear progression of human development, one that didn't have room for anomalies that defied biological classification. But while the official reports were scrubbed, the local press in the burgeoning towns of Nevada and Utah wasn't so easily controlled. Small-town newspapers of the 1870s and ADS often featured accounts from miners and ranch hands who stumbled upon similar remains in the high caves of the Humboldt Range. These reports frequently mentioned men of extraordinary stature, often measuring between 7 and 8 feet in height, buried with artifacts that suggested a high degree of craftsmanship. Yet, every time a discovery was reported to the authorities, the same pattern emerged. A representative from a state university or a federal agency would arrive, the site would be cordoned off, and the physical evidence would be moved east for study. But those studies were rarely, if ever, published. Some historians believe that the sheer volume of these reports suggests a widespread phenomenon that the central institutions were simply unequipped to handle. The official narrative was that these were misidentified fossils of Pleistocene megafauna mammoths, or ground sloths, whose bones were mistaken for human by untrained eyes. However, this explanation fails to account for the detailed descriptions of tools, woven textiles, and the undeniable presence of human-like dentition. And that's when a new piece of the puzzle surfaced in the National Archives. In the late 20th century, a researcher uncovered a series of letters between a field clerk and a superior in the Department of the Interior, dated 1872. The letters discussed the anomalous osteological materials collected during the Wheeler surveys. The tone was not one of scientific curiosity, but of logistical concern. The clerk complained that the size and weight of the crates were causing delays in the transport of more practical mineral samples. He specifically mentioned a cranium of such breadth that it required a custom-built container. This letter provides a rare documented link between the 1870 discovery and the federal infrastructure. It confirms that the remains were not just found, they were possessed by the state. But where they went after reaching the railhead in Omaha remains a matter of intense debate. There is no clear consensus on why such findings would be suppressed. One theory suggests that the 19th century scientific establishment was gripped by a rigid adherence to the mound builder myth. At the time, it was widely believed that a superior race had once occupied the Americas before being replaced by the indigenous tribes encountered by Europeans. To find evidence of a biologically distinct, perhaps even larger, group of humans would have complicated an already volatile political landscape. It was easier to disappear the evidence than to rewrite the newly established textbooks of American prehistory. What happened next, however, suggests that the secrecy wasn't just about the bones, but about what they represented for the future of the West. Personal stories from the descendants of the 1870 survey team offer a more intimate look at the psychological toll of the discovery. The family of Elias Thorne, the surveyor who kept the shadow log, maintained for generations that Elias was never the same after the expedition. He reportedly suffered from recurring nightmares and a profound sense of being followed. According to family lore, he was visited twice by men claiming to be from the Census Bureau who asked specifically about his time in the High Sierras. Whether this was genuine government surveillance or the paranoia of a man who had seen something he couldn't explain is impossible to verify. But Thorne wasn't the only one. Another member of the party, a geologist named Marcus Whitaker, abandoned his career entirely within 2 years of the survey, moving to a remote farm in Vermont and refusing to speak of his time in the territories. As the 1880s progressed, the frequency of these giant reports increased, then peaked before abruptly falling off. It was as if a curtain had been drawn across the high altitudes. The 1870 site on the Limestone Ridge was never officially revisited by a scientific body. Modern attempts to locate the exact coordinates based on the surviving topographical maps have been met with frustration. The landmarks described in the surviving portions of the field notes a double-peaked spire and a dry creek bed in the shape of a serpent seem to have vanished or been altered by a century of seismic activity and erosion. Some researchers believe the site was intentionally dynamited to prevent amateur excavations, a common practice for unstable geological formations at the time. But the paper trail didn't entirely disappear. In 1882, a curious entry appeared in the Smithsonian's own annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology. It mentioned, in a brief and dismissive paragraph, the receipt of fragmentary skeletal remains of unusual size from the Western Territories. The report concluded that these were undoubtedly the result of a rare pathological condition, or more likely, a hoax perpetrated by local inhabitants. This dismissive tone became the standard institutional response for the next century. Yet, the report didn't explain why a hoax would require a lead-line dispatch box or the intervention of a Department of War colonel. The discrepancy between the official dismissal and the high-level response of 1,870 remains one of the most glaring contradictions in the record. Evidence layers began to build up not just from the 1,870 survey, but from contemporary excavations across the country. From the Kanawha Valley to the mounds of Ohio, similar reports of 7 to 8 foot skeletons were being logged by professional archaeologists before those reports were quietly amended or the bones were lost in transit. There is a persistent rumor among archival researchers of a Room 32 or a similar off-site storage facility where the anomalies of the 19th century were sequestered. While there is no direct evidence of a secret warehouse, the sheer volume of lost artifacts from this period is statistically significant. It suggests a systemic failure of the chain of custody or a deliberate policy of removal. The escalation of the mystery reached a turning point in the early 1890s during the preparations for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Anthropologists were scouring the country for typical American specimens to display. Records suggest that one of the original 1,870 surveyors, now an elderly man, wrote to the exposition committee, offering to lead them to the site of the mountain giants. He claimed he could prove that the history being presented to the public was incomplete. The committee's response was cold. They informed him that his services were not required and that the scientific narrative of the continent had already been finalized. This was the moment the door officially closed. The 1,870 discovery was no longer a matter of scientific debate. It had become an institutional inconvenience. What doesn't add up is the total lack of follow-up. In any other field of science, a find of this magnitude would have sparked decades of inquiry. Even if the remains were pathological, they would have been a medical marvel worth studying. The total silence, the scrubbing of maps, the reassignment of witnesses, the confiscation of notes points to a motivation that goes beyond scientific disagreement. It suggests a fear of the unknown that was so profound, it necessitated the erasure of the discovery from the collective memory of the nation. But even the best laid plans for erasure have their cracks. The transition from the 19th to the 20th century saw the total collapse of the mountain giant narrative within professional circles. As the original surveyors passed away, their first-hand accounts died with them, leaving only fragmented diaries and censored official logs. The limestone ridge, once a site of profound biological confusion, was reclaimed by the desert. Some historians believe that the landscape itself conspired in this disappearance. The Southwest is a region of violent shifts, flash floods, landslides, and seismic tremors that can reshape a canyon in a single afternoon. By 1910, the topographical markers Elias Thorne had described were no longer recognizable. The double-peaked spire may have crumbled, and the serpent-shaped creek likely dried into a featureless wash. The physical door to the past had been shut by the very environment the surveyors had sought to master. In the aftermath, the discovery was relegated to the realm of fringed tall tales and campfire stories. The Smithsonian and other major institutions solidified a version of history that was clean, manageable, and devoid of giants. For decades, anyone suggesting the existence of the 1,870 remains was met with the same institutional barrier. If it existed, where is the evidence? This logical loop where the evidence was confiscated to prove it didn't exist became the standard defense. But the modern era has brought new tools to this cold case. Independent researchers, utilizing digitized archives and high-resolution satellite imagery, have begun to cross-reference the surviving Wheeler survey notes with modern terrain maps. Modern re-examination has revealed several anomalies in the federal record that were previously overlooked. Digital scans of the 1870 ledger show that the ink on the missing pages was not simply lost. The pages were surgically removed with a blade, a precision that suggests an administrative act rather than wear and tear. Furthermore, LiDAR technology has identified several unnatural depressions in the remote regions of the Sierras that correspond roughly to the coordinates Thorne alluded to in his private journals. These sites, often located in the most inaccessible reaches of federal land, remain unexcavated. There is no clear consensus on whether these depressions are geological or archaeological, but they remain a point of interest for those who believe the 1870 report was grounded in physical reality. The question remains, why does the 1870 discovery still resonate today? Perhaps it is because it represents a moment when the world felt larger and more mysterious than it does now. The idea that a group of highly trained, skeptical scientists could encounter something that defied their entire worldview is a powerful reminder of the limits of human knowledge. What happened next remains unclear, as the lead-lined crates mentioned in the Department of the Interior letters have never been located in any public inventory. Whether they sit in a forgotten corner of a government warehouse or were destroyed to preserve a specific version of history is a matter of speculation. What we are left with is a collection of shadows, sketches of bones that no longer exist, letters about crates that were never opened, and the silence of a mountain ridge that has been wiped from the map. The 1870 mountain surveyors set out to map the world to bring light to the dark corners of the frontier. Instead, they found something that forced the light to be turned away. As we look back at those faded field notes, we are forced to wonder how much of our history is based on what was found and how much is based on what we were told to forget. The wind still blows across those high plateaus, and beneath the limestone and the dust, the secrets of the old ones may still be waiting for a generation willing to look at the evidence without blinking.